To serve means to struggle with the ungodly nature. To not serve means being good without effort. This definition helps us finally understand what really happened to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and will clarify what is thought to be original sin and the fall of man. This informative and revealing tape discusses the virtue of struggling with our ungodly nature, which gives us an understanding of how the Baal Teshuvah is greater than the Tsadik. The discussion touches on the heroic nature of the Holocaust martyrs and goes on to bring out that in our struggle to serve, the guidance of a Rebbe is indispensable.
God created Adam and Eve. He created them perfect or righteous or straight, however we want to translate the word. And then, not very long after that, they did something wrong. Immediately after that, they regretted what they did wrong. So right there in the first chapter of Torah, in the first day of history, we have already the three conditions that make up the Jewish people. Because the word tzibur, which means community, congregation, is composed of 4 letters, Hebrew letters, and the letters stand for Tsadik, Beinani, V'Rasha, the righteous, the in-between, and the wicked. And that's what makes up the Jewish community, a Tsadik, a Beinani, and a Rasha. Of course, a Rasha, a sinful person, is a condition that must be temporary. And the whole purpose of the existence of sin is only to lead to improvement and to Teshuvah. So right on the first day of history, we already have a Tsadik, a sinner, and a Baal Teshuvah. Of course, they were all the same person, or the same 2 people. For a moment they were Tzadikim. A moment later they were Rishayim, they had sinned. And a moment later, they were Baalei Teshuvah, they had repented, they had done Teshuvah. Now it's true of all things that the beginning, the origins of all things, comes in a very brief and intense form. And brief means not that there are no details, but that the details are swallowed up and lost in the intensity of the moment. The beginning of the birth of a child, the moment of conception, all the details that are going to follow, that will make up the child, and there are millions of details, they're all there at the first moment. Otherwise, where would they be coming from? So they have to be there in the beginning. And yet, by definition, beginnings have to be brief, and beginnings have to be intense. So the details are lost because of the brevity and intensity of the beginning. And the same is also true with an idea, with a concept. A person can discover the most useful and the most practical of concepts that can be applied everywhere and anywhere and in a million different places. It's got a lot of details, and yet it all happens in a moment. In that one moment that the concept arrives, that flashes into your head. At that moment, the details are not visible, but they are there. They must be there. They exist within the germ of the concept. If we were to look closer, as a matter of fact, this is the way we're supposed to learn. After we discover a brilliant new idea in which the details are submerged, when the details later do emerge, we're supposed to go back and check to see whether these details were there in the beginning, or are they details that have erroneously entered into the picture and don't really belong as part of this concept. That's how we check out the truth of a concept. You develop its details, then you check the details to see if it's consistent with the original germ of the idea. So that when we check back, after the details have emerged, we can then look back and see the details in the origin itself, which is where it came from, and must fit back in again in order to be valid. So we test the concept that way. The Torah tells us that everything that happened to the patriarchs is a sign for the children, for later generations. In different words, it means that what happens in the beginning determines to a great degree what's going to happen in the end. So that everything we're experiencing and everything we're going through, we should be able to trace it and find it in something that happened to our patriarchs, to our origins, to our beginnings. And that which is most crucial to us should be most evident in our beginnings. What do we see on the first day of creation? On the first day of creation, we see man go from being a Tsadik to becoming a Baal Teshuvah. It happened very quickly, it happened very intensely, and it happened on a level that we cannot compare ourselves to. But to try to understand a little bit the story of Adam and Eve is necessary, appropriate. The actual event, as it's described in the Gemara, is that Adam and Eve were created on the sixth day of creation, which was Friday. They were created in the afternoon, and immediately after they were created, they were told that they could eat from any tree in the garden, but they could not eat from that one tree, the tree of knowledge, the Eitz Hadas. Now Shabbos was to begin a few hours later, and they were told that once Shabbos sets in, they would be allowed to eat even from that tree of knowledge. But until Shabbos, they were not permitted to eat it. So actually the prohibition against eating from the tree of knowledge was a temporary one that was meant to last only a few hours. In the meantime, Chava gave birth to 2 children, to Cain and Abel, and before Shabbos set in, they had already eaten from the tree of knowledge. As a matter of fact, they had already been confronted by God, they had already done Teshuvah, and all of this before Shabbos. Now that's very intense. That's a busy afternoon. But the problem, the question, God had created the most perfect of human beings and had breathed into them a part of himself, had given them permission to eat anything their heart desired in the entire Garden of Eden. And there must have been good things to eat there. Only one tree was prohibited, and even that only for a few hours. So no matter how intense their desire for whatever fruit that tree was, and it wasn't an apple, according to different opinions in the Gemara, it was either grapes or figs or wheat, but it wasn't apples. The most common opinion is that it was a fig tree. And the explanation given is that after they had eaten from the tree of knowledge and they realized that they were naked and were ashamed, they took a fig leaf and covered themselves. The idea here being that Teshuvah is a way in which you correct what you had made wrong, using the fig tree to undo or correct what they had made wrong. So they used the fig leaf to correct the sin that they had committed with the fig tree. So that's the explanation of the opinion that says it was a fig tree. But there's another opinion that says it was grapes and he was actually making Kiddush before Shabbos. But back to the question. The question is, regardless of what the tree was, it couldn't possibly have been so tempting and so irresistible that the most perfect of human beings, God's handiwork, could not wait for a few hours. I mean, there are those people who are very proud of the fact that the Torah does not conceal the faults of its heroes. And that's very nice, but that's not what Torah is all about. Even if we were to go along with this argument along those lines, Torah doesn't conceal the faults of its heroes. But what kind of a hero is a person who cannot refrain from eating a fruit for a few hours? I mean, that's not showing the imperfection of the great people. That's not a great person. That's not even an average person. And what makes it even worse is that when God accuses him, Adam, and he says, "What did you do?" What does he say? He says, "The woman you gave me made me do it." I mean, that's not a great person. But even that needs explanation, because that's not the response you would expect of someone created perfect by God's hand. That's not the response of an average intelligent person. You did something wrong, you don't blame it on somebody else. And yet Adam, in all of the writings and in all the Gemara and all of our history, is treated as a Tsadik, as he should be. As a matter of fact, we're told that his wisdom was greater than anyone else who came after him, and that his neshama was higher than anyone else in history, and will be higher than anyone else except for Mashiach. By the way, his name Adam, 3 Hebrew letters, Aleph, Daled, Mem, stand for the 3 names, Adam, David, Mashiach, which covers basically all of history. Adam is the beginning of history, and King David is the middle of history, and Mashiach, of course, is the end of history, the conclusion. So how do we understand that Adam and Chava, being the perfect creations, couldn't wait a few hours and ate from the tree of knowledge. This is, by the way, true of all the stories in the Bible, in the Torah. When we read about things that seem kind of petty or sinful or imperfect and so on, the Torah really doesn't talk about insignificant people and insignificant events. So we have to progress from the childish Bible story level of understanding the Torah to a more appropriate understanding of the Torah. With this story of Adam and Eve, let's put ourselves in their shoes, so to speak, if they wore shoes. If we were Adam and Chava, and we opened our eyes, and all of a sudden, we exist, we are. We're not babies because God didn't create fetuses, He created human beings. So they were physically matured to the age of 20 years old, in the minute they opened their eyes, which was true of the whole world. The whole world was a mature world the moment that it was created. So it was young and old at the same time, which resolves the question of the chicken and the egg. The chicken was created, not eggs. In fact, of course the world is old, but it's still only 5,000 years old. It's an aged world, but the aging was rushed. Adam and Chava opened their eyes, and suddenly they were 20 years old. And they were intelligent. So what did they think? Now, remembering that they were tzaddikim with very lofty souls, their first thought must have been, why did God create us? What is our purpose? How do we serve God? So God comes to them and says, you were created to take care of the garden, to work it and to guard it, which means that there are things that you have to do, positive things, and there are things you have to prevent. To work the garden means to do something. To guard the garden means to prevent something from happening. So, fine. The next thing God says to them is, from all the trees of the garden you may eat except for this one. Now, being intelligent, moral, godly, righteous people, they couldn't rest. They were uncomfortable with the presence of something prohibited, something not kosher, ungodly. Here is the Garden of Eden. God created all this. It's all perfect. Nothing has been soiled. And yet already there is something not kosher in the garden. Why? Why in the Garden of Eden should there be a tree that you're not allowed to eat? So it's not that they couldn't resist the temptation of the fruit. Morally, they had to find an answer. This is the garden that we're supposed to take care of. God created us to guard and to work this garden. And right in the middle of the garden is something not kosher. How come? Why? Well, God said to them that they should not eat from it. So they first explained to themselves that the purpose of this tree is that it be avoided. It's got a negative purpose. Some things have positive purpose, some a negative purpose. The purpose of other trees is to be eaten, and the purpose of this tree is to avoid eating it, to refuse eating it, to be tempted by it, and to refuse the temptation. What's going to be if you refuse eating it? If you refuse eating it, you will be a good guy, and the tree will remain unkosher. So they reasoned to themselves that can't be. It can't be that something in God's world should remain unkosher. It must be that the purpose of this tree is to become holy as well, to become part of holiness. You can't just leave it ungodly. So they're told further, if they would only wait until Shabbos, it too will become kosher. So you see, everything in the end must become kosher. Everything has to become one with God. And nothing can remain unkosher. So you see that when Shabbos will come, it will be made kosher. It will become kosher. Turning this around, applying it to in modern terms, everything in the world has to serve a godly purpose and has to become one with God. So when Mashiach comes, what will happen? Now, Adam and Chava could have said to themselves, look, let's stay out of trouble. We'll eat only the trees we're allowed to eat. We'll stay away from the tree we're not allowed to eat. And what's going to become of this tree, we'll wait. Shabbos will come, it'll become kosher, and everything will be perfect. But they couldn't let it go at that. And for a good reason. If the tree will become kosher because Shabbos has come, then the holiness of the tree will not be its own. The tree will essentially remain unholy. It's just that Shabbos, everything is elevated because of the holiness of Shabbos. And then even the tree can be included in holiness. But that holiness is coming from Shabbos, from above. It's not coming from the tree. For example, when we eat during the week, everything we eat during the week, as kosher as the food is, we have to eat it for some godly purpose. We have to bring some godly intention, some higher intention to the act of eating. Because just to eat for the sake of eating is itself not kosher, even when the food is kosher. And that's why when we eat during the week, we have to give it a purpose. We have to eat l'shem shamayim, for the sake of heaven, with the intention to use the strength and the energy we get from the food to do mitzvahs and to do good things. But on Shabbos, we don't have to eat with a higher intention. When we eat on Shabbos, that itself is a mitzvah. We don't have to have more purpose than that. During the week, you have to eat and then use the energy to get from the food in the act of a mitzvah, and then the eating has been elevated or justified. But on Shabbos, the eating itself is a mitzvah. You don't have to embellish it. You don't have to add a mitzvah that will result from the eating in order to make the eating a mitzvah. Because the Shabbos meal is itself a mitzvah. So why is that? Not because food is holier on Shabbos, but because Shabbos is holy. Shabbos brings a holiness to you and to the food and to the act of eating and so on. So it's because of the presence of Shabbos that everything is elevated. And therefore you can eat that food without fear of being corrupted or dragged down by it, which is what eating generally does to a person. But it's not that the food itself has become holy. It's that Shabbos has had an effect on the food. The holiness of Shabbos reaches even to the physical condition of food, of eating. But the food itself, of itself, hasn't become holy, and that's why even eating on Shabbos should be done with some caution, even though it's a mitzvah. But it's the kind of mitzvah you have to be careful with, because it can become unholy since the food itself hasn't changed. So if Shabbos would come, you would be allowed to eat from that tree of knowledge. The tree would become kosher, but it wouldn't become holy of itself. So Adam and Chava decided that they can't sit back and let it become holy through an indirect influence, here being the holiness of Shabbos. They have to do something to make the tree itself holy. Something within the tree has to be brought out that is holy, that will affect the rest of the tree and make the whole thing holy. And there's only one way in which that which is not allowed can become holy. There are three conditions. There's that which is already holy, like Shabbos or a pair of tefillin, a Torah. There's that which is unholy, like non-kosher food. And then there are those things that are neutral. Neither a mitzvah nor a sin. And in Hebrew that's called mutar. Mutar means untied, not bound, not chained. It is not tied to holiness. It's not tied to unholiness. It's loose, it's free. It can become either one. If we use these things that are mutar for holiness, then they too become holy, because they're neutral and can go either way. When we use those things that are permissible, neutral, for unholy purposes, then they become unholy themselves. But those things that are not permitted, the prohibited things, which in Torah are called asur. Asur means tied, like matir asurim. Tied means you can't use it for whatever purpose you wish. It's bound, it's chained to evil, to unholiness, to ungodliness. You can't make it good by using it for a good purpose. And that's why you're not allowed to use it, because it can't become good. There's one exception. If for some reason a Jew does the sin, whatever it is, and partakes of this prohibited thing, but then he regrets it in the way that a Jew can regret, the way that only a Jew can regret, then that itself, the thing itself, becomes holy. that which was once prohibited becomes not only neutralized, it becomes holy. Because originally the effect that it had was that it separated the person from God. It severed the strings and the channels through which a Jew is connected to God, made him less sensitive to God, made him more callous and so on. And now, the very fact that he ate this non-kosher thing, the non-kosher thing is now, when he regrets it, is now making him more sensitive. He will now be more careful in keeping kosher because he once ate this non-kosher food. So the non-kosher food had become, through the regret, motivation for holiness. It now pushes him to be more careful than a person who never ate anything unkosher in his life. So this prohibited food has now become a force for godliness. And that's the only way that a prohibited thing can itself become good. Not indirectly, through the influence of something holier that comes from above, like Shabbos. Therefore, Adam and Chava had to make a quick calculation. And they figured all this out. And they decided that being tzaddikim is not necessarily the best way to be. They could easily have remained tzaddikim. Stay away from the tree, be a tzaddik, nobody will ever have any complaints to you, there'll be no problems, you'll live forever, but you will not have accomplished anything in this world. So God comes to them and says, don't eat from this tree, and they go ahead and they eat it. Why? Because they figured out that it is better and more important in God's plan to be a Baal Teshuvah than to remain a tzaddik. Because only through Teshuvah can you make holy that which is unholy. So it wasn't that they were violating God's commandment because of an evil desire, because of a weakness, because they were giving in to their animal soul, to their Yetzer Hara. It was the godly purpose for which they were created that motivated them to make this decision and to eat from the tree. Because they understood that that ultimately is what God wants. Now, obviously, God commanded them not to eat it. God commanded them not to eat it because it is unholy. It is an unholy thing. But even unholiness, which is prohibited, which must be prohibited, even that must in some way eventually, ultimately be brought to holiness. And so they started that process. A number of times later on in history, Jews were given the same choice, to be tzaddikim or to expose themselves to negative influences and have to rise above them by doing teshuvah. For example, came time for the Jews to go into Israel. They had wandered in the desert for 40 years, and now it was time to go into Israel, and the leaders didn't want to go. They said, no, we want to stay in the desert. Why? Because they were tzaddikim. And it is easier to be a tzaddik in a desert. I mean, obviously. Behind this whole thing, giving a little background here, there's a question, an assumption behind this whole issue. And that is, what is the purpose of sin? I mean, if you stop and think, why did God create sin? Which is really not the topic right now, but it gives us a basis on which to discuss this thing. The idea right now is that they understood that if there exists something sinful, it is up to them to do something about it. And what must they do about it? They must change the sinfulness of this world into holiness. Not just the neutral, innocent things of the world. And if you have to get your hands dirty, as the expression goes, then that's it. Then that's what you've been sent to earth to do. So in essence, they didn't sin at all. Sin exists only as a means towards towards a godliness, towards a holiness, a way of getting to that which is holy, which, for whatever reason, is hidden and buried behind or beneath that which is unholy. So the reason that sin exists at all is only because it can become a positive thing through teshuvah. So why can't we sin and become Baalei Teshuvah? First we'll do the sin, and then we'll regret. We'll become, because we probably won't. That's first of all. And second of all, they weren't doing it for themselves. It's not Adam and Chava who became the Baalei Teshuvah. Because if they had, then the world would have been perfect, Mashiach would have come, and that would have been it. They did it in order to set the tone for future generations. That in future generations the ideal will be Teshuvah and not Tsadik. And so we see that on that day, on that afternoon, the whole drama of history played itself out. They were Tzadikim, like souls in heaven. They lowered themselves into this world, were affected by it, and did Teshuvah for it, and became Baalei Teshuvah. If their sin wasn't a sin, as we're saying now, why then do we see punishments? The Torah describes punishments that they received, which is the question everybody asks. But as long as we're looking at the story on a more sophisticated and a more mature level, then we have to look at the punishment through those same eyes as well. And when you look at those punishments, you realize they really aren't punishments at all. It's the process of getting your hands dirty in order to raise the unholy or the world back up again. For example, the immediate punishment was that they had to leave the Garden of Eden. Well, it sounds like a punishment. But it wasn't a punishment. It was their choice. When they decided that they're going to eat from the tree of knowledge because they want to elevate the world from the bottom, from its lowest level, they knew that they would have to leave the Garden of Eden, because the Garden of Eden is not the lowest, most earthy place on earth. So that was their choice. Their choice was to no longer live in Gan Eden, in the Garden of Eden, but to live in the earthy world, in the lower world, in the outside world. And so they were told, you ate from the tree of knowledge, now you leave. You go out into the earthy world, into the gutsy world. So it didn't come as a surprise to them, and it really wasn't a punishment. It was part of their decision, part of the soul coming down to earth. That's what they chose. They said, we can't remain forever in this elevated plane. We got to go down to Egypt and come back up. And so all those punishments really weren't punishments at all. These are the steps in the evolution, if we can use that term, of man's purpose. And that is to leave heaven, come down to earth, grapple with it, and raise it up. In different words, what is the purpose for which God created this world? The purpose is that the lowest possible condition, lowest meaning the furthest from God, the most ungodly possible condition, should become a comfortable place, a home to God. That's the idea of the oneness of God, that no ungodly condition can remain that does not become, through man's effort, a comfortable home for God, one with God. And then on that day, God will be one, His name will be one, there will be no evil left in the world, and that's the whole purpose for which God created the world. As Hasidus discusses often and at length, the purpose of creation is that God desires a dwelling place in the lowest world. How do we make a dwelling place for God in this lowest world? Two things. First of all, nothing must remain outside of this plan. As with Adam and Chava, all the trees were kosher. Only one tree wasn't, and that was not acceptable. Why did it bother them so much? Because one tree it was only one tree, and yet it disturbed them. As long as there is one unkosher tree, then it's not God's garden. Then God is not comfortable in His garden, because there is something there that isn't godly at all. So the first point of making a home for God is that nothing should remain ungodly. That which makes God uncomfortable shouldn't be there. People are surprised that the Rebbe has been so devoted to the idea of reminding non-Jews about the 7 mitzvahs that everybody is supposed to keep, all mankind. And people are saying, what? And all Jews are already doing what Jews are supposed to do. We're doing it already. We're ready to start working on non-Jews. The point is that makes no difference. The world has to become a home for God, and that means everything. It's not enough, we'll be good. That's not enough. The world must become good. Every last tree in the garden must become holy. Because if this is to be God's home, in God's home, an unholy thing does not belong. The second thing is that in making a dwelling place for God, not only must every detail become holy, but holiness must come from within from the thing itself. Not that we can somehow envelop everything in some kind of a holiness and externally everything becomes good. That's not true. That's not thorough. It's not enough. The holiness must come from within the thing itself. In a classical example, when the Alter Rebbe was arrested under the Tsar in Russia, he was kept in a fortress called Petropavlovsk, the Peter Paul fortress. Now the prison house, the cells, were separated from the offices, from the headquarters, by a river. The headquarters were called Tiny Soviet. Today, if you visit Russia, you can actually visit this fortress. It's now a museum. So when the prisoners needed to be interrogated in the offices, in the headquarters, they had to be ferried across the river on a boat. So during his imprisonment, the Rebbe was being ferried across the river, and it was in the middle of the month, and when the moon was full. So there's a mitzvah that we fulfill in the middle of the month, and that is the Kiddush Levana, sanctifying the fullness of the moon. But since every prayer has to be said with concentration, and you can't concentrate on a moving boat, so he asked the captain of the boat, the oarsman, to stop the boat. And of course, the Russian boatman wouldn't hear of it. So the boat suddenly stopped of itself in the water, just stood still in the water. And the boatman realized that he wasn't dealing here with a common prisoner. So the Rebbe again asked him, "Will you please stop the boat?" And this time he agreed, of course. So then the Rebbe got up and he said the Kiddush Levana, and he was content. So when the Rebbe tells the story, and he emphasizes that after the boat had stopped of its own accord in the water, miraculously, the Alter Rebbe again asks the boatman if he would agree to stop. Why did he have to do that? The boat had already stopped. He could get up and say his prayers and everything would be fine. So the Rebbe explains that the Alter Rebbe didn't want to do a mitzvah under unnatural conditions, in miraculous conditions, because the purpose of the mitzvah is to affect the world as it is, from within, not from above. So if you change the state of nature, you perform a miracle. Next time you perform a miracle, and you stop a boat in the middle of the water unnaturally, you're not in a natural condition. So should you then do a mitzvah, say a bracha, daven, whatever, the mitzvah will not affect nature, because it doesn't touch nature. You've placed yourself outside of nature in a miraculous condition, so the mitzvah is not in touch with nature and therefore has no effect on nature. So the Rebbe says, would you agree willingly to stop the boat? Will this non-Jewish Russian anti-Semite agree to stop the boat? And when he said yes, then you can do a mitzvah. Now you're in touch with reality. Your mitzvah will affect nature as nature is in all of its grubbiness. Because the holiness that we're supposed to produce from within nature, not from above nature. Not to wait until Shabbos comes and then everything will be holy. And that's why we don't sit around waiting for Mashiach. I mean, we could say, when Mashiach comes and makes the world good, then everything will be fine. And Mashiach must come, so why bother? When Mashiach comes, everything will be good, but it'll be good from above. Our job is to make everything good from below. So from within nature, from within the unholiness, we are to raise the world up on its own steam, using natural means and natural efforts to bring the world closer to God, and that will bring Mashiach. There'll be an additional godliness and more holiness revealed from above when Mashiach comes, but the world has to be elevated towards that level from within itself. Mashiach is not going to come unless the world is elevated to some degree. I mean, you can't pour water until you have a cup in which to catch the water. So you have to create the vessel, and then the water can be poured to fill the vessel. And what we see from this whole thing is that there are basically two types of Jews. There are those Jews whom God created to be tzaddikim. They were created that way. They were born without an appetite for sinful things. They were born without even an appetite for physical things. They have no personal desires. They have no ego. They have no selfishness at all in them. Their entire existence is an expression of God's will. Then there's the other person, the other kind of Jew that God created, who is very much attracted and attached to the physical world. He's very much affected by the physical world. The difference between these two people, aside from their difference in character, is the effect that they have on the world. The Tsadik has an effect on the world from above. His holiness and his godliness affects the world, affects the rest of the world by shedding some of its holiness and godliness over the world. So he brings to the world a godliness that wouldn't otherwise be there. The rest of us, common folk, have to work our way up, disengage from our attachment to the physical world, which is an effort, and work ourselves up to godliness. But in this disengaging, we take with us the element of this world, of the physical, and bring it with us to God. We raise it up as we raise ourselves. In other words, when we bring holiness to the world, we bring it from within the world at close range. We don't abandon the physical. We have to take it with us towards godliness. I don't know who suffers more, but we have a rougher job. Maybe not a more difficult job, but a rougher job than the Tsadik. Because the Tsadik, although he works hard at increasing his holiness and sharing the holiness, but he doesn't have to deal firsthand with undesirable things. Whereas the non-tzaddik, the average person, is very much in touch with the undesirable things and very much aware of undesirable things and has to grapple with that. There's a statement in one of the prophets where it says, "Come and you will see the difference between the tzaddik and the rasha, between the one who serves God and the one who doesn't serve him." And in Tanya, the Rebbe explains that the statement of the prophet describes 4 kinds of Jews, not 2 kinds, 4 kinds. The tzaddik and the rasha is 2, and then the one who serves him, the one who serves God, is a 3rd, and the one who does not serve him is a 3rd kind of Jew, a 3rd level. 4 different kinds of Jews. The tzaddik, we already said, is someone who has no desire for sin, who has no evil inclination, and whose purpose is to shed godliness onto the world, to share his godliness with the world from above. The rasha is somebody who gives in to his evil inclination. He is sometimes a victim to his own temptations. That's a rasha. Then there's the one who serves God. In Hebrew, the word for serving is oved. The word avoda is explained in Torah to mean transforming. If you're running up and down the stairs or up and down a mountain, no matter how tired you get, that's not avoda. It's a waste of time. Avoda means when you've taken something and you've transformed it. If nothing changes as a result of your efforts, then that effort can't be called avoda. In some sense, the tzaddik, who is not working from within the world to change the world, isn't transforming anything. And therefore, he's not called Oved Hashem. He's not called one who serves God. A tzaddik is called God's son. A tzaddik is called Eved Hashem, but not Oved Hashem. One who is serving God. Who is the one who is serving God? The average person. The person who has temptations. The person who has both an animal soul and a godly soul. And the two souls are constantly in conflict. And the person has to struggle to maintain his balance. He has to overcome temptation. He has to raise himself from the condition that he was born into to some higher condition. That's transforming. Teaching an animal soul to behave itself. teaching our animal instincts to become more mensch-like, menschlich. That's transforming. That's called Oved Hashem. Then there's the person who is saintly by nature. He is not sinful, and he's not struggling. So what is he? This is a person who has an animal soul. He has an evil inclination. He's not a Tsadik. But his animal soul and his evil inclination are so passive, they're so tepid, that it's no effort for him to be good. He ignores it. It's only a mild disturbance. He finds no need to struggle with it. His animal soul is an obedient one. It's an animal, but it's a tame animal. And he says no, so it's no. He thinks, maybe I should go sin today. But then again, in order to do that, takes a little effort, so I won't sin. There are people whose animal soul, the Gemara tells us, is like a wild animal, a raging bull, who won't take no for an answer. And then there are other people whose animal souls are like lambs. Whatever you tell it, it'll do. Sin, okay, we'll sin. Not sin, all right, so we won't sin. That's the kind of a person who can be very good. You find nothing wrong with him. He can't be accused of anything sinful. He doesn't sin. But on the other hand, he's not a tzaddik. It's not that he doesn't have temptation. And it's not that he loves God so totally that there's no room left in his heart for anything else. He's also not serving God because he's not changing anything. And that's possibly the worst condition to be in. There's an old expression among Hasidim, a Yiddish expression, that basically translates into English that God can help even a good person. Which means that even a good guy, the Eibishter can help him, God can help him, that he should also become a mensch, that he should also be able to serve God. And what's wrong with the good guy? The good guy finds no motivation. Why should he struggle? Everything's fine. You're supposed to learn. Yeah, he likes to learn. You're not supposed to sin? Fine, he doesn't like to sin either. Not that he has no temptation for it, not that he's a tzaddik, but when he says no, then it's no. And besides, he's busy learning. He's of that disposition, of that nature, that he likes to read, he likes to learn, he likes to be left alone. So somehow, without any effort, without much effort, his animal soul remains under control. But not that the animal soul is changing and becoming better than it was at birth. He's doing a lot of mitzvahs. That's true. He's a wonderful person. He's a good. He would make a good neighbor, and he'll be rewarded for all the mitzvahs that he does. But he's not fulfilling the purpose for which God created us, which is to change the world. He's supposed to work at growing and raising himself above his nature. He's got to find that mitzvah which doesn't come easily to him or readily. Somewhere there's got to be a mitzvah that even he would have to make some effort to fulfill. That's the mitzvah he's got to find. Somewhere there's a temptation that he's not resisting completely. That's the one he's got to fight and struggle with. So all this leads us to one very practical and important conclusion. We're supposed to love our fellow Jew unconditionally. That's the mitzvah. We're supposed to be humble in our relationship with every other human being. And the Rebbe says in Tanya, stop and think for a moment. When you're judging another Jew, and you see that he does things that we're not allowed to do, so you immediately assume that he's not as good a Jew as you are. It's a pretty rational, logical conclusion. You don't do that sin, he does do that sin, so you're the better Jew. But according to what we've been saying until now, what really is a better Jew? How do we measure goodness or the quality of a Jew? If you're going to look at the neshama of a Jew, then sin doesn't count at all, because it's not the neshama of the Jew that sins. Even when a Jew does sin, his neshama remains absolutely perfect and holy and so on. So as far as the soul goes, we're all equal, equally great. On the other hand, if a good Jew is not one who has a soul that is Jewish, because every Jew has that. If a good Jew is one who is doing what he was created to do, then what is it that we were created to do? Generally, mitzvahs. But But what is the purpose of the mitzvah? The purpose of the mitzvah is to transform the physical world, to transform our physical nature. So who is transformed? Not someone who finds it easy to be good, not the Tsadik, not the person who struggles, only the person who struggles. Because if you're not struggling, then you're not changing, you're not transforming, and thereby you're not serving God. Because change must demand some effort and some struggle. So you want to judge the virtue of a Jew? You judge not by the accomplishments, not by what level you find him at, but by the effort that he had to put into reaching that level. You take a look at the person and you say, look, the guy has been studying Torah for 5 years, and he's been keeping all the mitzvahs for 5 years, and yet he still lies. He still loses his temper. And you wonder, what's the point? What's the good of the whole thing? The question is not, does he ever lose his temper? The question is not, does he ever lie? The question is, how much has he changed? If this person was incredibly angry, and now there are times when he can control his anger, that's a big change. And you say, yeah, but he still loses his temper. So what does that show? So it shows that he's not a tzaddik. Well, he wasn't created to be a tzaddik. So you say, well then, what good is it, all this Torah and all the studying that he does? The good is measured not by where it's gotten him, but by how far he's come. So it's not that we set up an arbitrary goal, never to have a temper, never to lie, never to... It's very true that a person can be very developed, never lose his temper, never lie, never give in to temptation, and right next to him is a person who does lose his temper, who does lie, who does give in to temptation, and yet the second guy, the second one may be a lot better, far more virtuous in terms of how much he's accomplished as a Jew than the first guy. Because the first guy doesn't lose his temper simply because he doesn't have one. He doesn't give in to temptation because his temptations are tepid. He doesn't lie because that's his nature. So what has he changed? He's changed nothing. What effort has he made? He made no effort. The second guy, on the other hand, okay, so he still loses his temper, but not as much as before. He still lies, but not as much, not like before. He may still give in to temptation, but not the temptations he used to give in to. He has changed. And that little bit of change is more precious than a lot of goodness that comes without effort, without need for change. Not only for the person himself. You could say, oh, it's a personal virtue. He struggled, he deserves more credit. It's not just that he deserves more credit. The struggle is the task. It's not a personal virtue above and beyond the call of duty. It is the call of duty, the struggle, the transformation. That's the whole point for which God put us on earth. So it's not only that he deserves more credit for struggling. He accomplishes more by struggling. The struggle is evidence of the accomplishment. Therefore, if the person wants to be self-righteous, wants to look at another Jew and say, I'm better than that Jew, then what he has to judge is not his accomplishments, but his own efforts. For example, a person says, look, the guy loses his temper. He loses his temper. That's not a mensch. I'm a mensch. I never lose my temper. But if you want to judge, you want to compare, you want to find within yourself virtues that the other person doesn't have, the only virtue to look for is the virtue of effort. Where do you make the kind of effort in your Yiddishkeit, in your morality, that you expect the other person to make? You don't have a temper, so you don't have to struggle with a temper. But you condemn other people for losing their temper. In other words, for not winning in their struggle, for not fighting their tendency, for not refusing to lose control when they're angry. Well, where do you win in your struggle? What struggle do you make, and do you win in your struggles? And if you have no struggle, then don't compare yourself at all. Then you're not in the same ballpark. Then you haven't even gotten to a position where you can serve God. The person who doesn't have a temper still has a personality. It may not be an angry personality, but it's a personality. Therefore, it's very possible that this guy who has no temper loves to learn. So he loves to learn, so he sits and studies, and doesn't even have an occasion to lose his temper. But should somebody come into the room and say, excuse me, but I'm in big trouble, and I need you to help me right now. Come, save me. And this studious guy says, but I'm learning now. I can't tear myself away from my learning. So there's an area for him to struggle with. This is his weak spot, and he doesn't bother. Or if he struggles a little bit, eventually he gives in. He says, nah, I'd rather learn. I'll take off maybe a minute, but not more. So the idea is that those people who are not created to be tzaddikim are created to work through the world, with the world, and that means change. And change means to make something out of your animal condition. The godliness is there, but what will be with that tree that is not godly? What's going to be with that which is not kosher? And if we can make that one tree a little bit more kosher, we've accomplished more. We've done more for the world than the kashrus of all the trees, the other trees in the garden. Because that kashrus was given. It was created that way. How kosher does the tree have to be? The physical thing is unkosher because it denies God. The animal soul is different from the godly soul in the same way that emotions are different from intellect. The essence of intellect, or the virtue of intellect, is denial of self. The greatest quality that intellect has is that it can turn against itself and dismiss itself. For example, we're just talking to a young woman who's having some trouble with her marriage. And her friends are saying to her, why are you such a masochist? Why do you stay in this marriage? Leave it, get out. So she says, but I have 6 kids. So her friends say, well, don't live your life for your kids. Get out. And she's saying, but I can't see it that way. Am I crazy? Am I crazy for not getting out? So what's going on here? What's going on is that her logic tells her that it's a bad marriage. Intellectually, she agrees with her friends that this is a crazy situation. She's suffering, the kids are suffering. But something in her says, logic or no logic, this is my family. And in some strange way, that's satisfying even to her mind. Her mind is saying, so what if it's not logical? A family doesn't have to be logical. A family is a family. That's the virtue of intelligence. That's the nature of intelligence. You say, for example, this table is made of wood. Intelligence comes along and says, why? Does it have to be made out of wood? Maybe not. And if it doesn't have to be, then why is it, in this case, made out of wood? So the function of intelligence, of seichel, is that it doesn't accept a status quo. Just because it is that way, seichel says, well, who says it has to be? Maybe it doesn't have to be. And in its most glorious moments, seichel does the same thing to itself. You work at figuring out the logic in some area of science or of knowledge, and then you turn around and you say, okay, I understand, it's logical, makes sense, but big deal. Because it's logical doesn't necessarily mean that it's true. I mean, you can make a case for anything. You can argue logically the exact opposite of what you've just proved. So logic doesn't necessarily mean that that's the way it is. And so intelligence itself can say, I have figured this thing out. I have come to the most logical conclusion and the most reasonable conclusion, and yet I'm not convinced that my conclusion is true. Maybe it isn't true. Why did God create logic? And who is asking this question? Intelligence is asking, why is there intelligence? But that's an incredible virtue. When intelligence itself, the mind itself says, what's the function of intelligence? It's questioning itself. On the other hand, emotions have the exact opposite trait. The emotion is stuck in a status quo. The fact of existence is all there is for the emotion. So the emotion doesn't say, I'm angry now, but I wonder why I'm angry. Do I have to be angry? Emotion doesn't question itself. I am angry, and that's the end of it. As far as the emotion can see, that's the sum total of reality. I am angry. Right now, I'm angry. What's it going to cost me? What's it going to do to me? How is it going to harm me to be... Nothing matters. I am angry, and the emotion can't see past that. So when you come to a person and you say, you know if you let yourself get upset, if you get angry, it's going to make you sick. You have an ulcer. You can't afford to get angry. You've got a heart condition. You have high blood pressure. He doesn't understand what you want. I am angry. Can't see past that. So the animal soul is primarily emotion, and emotion means the inability to see past the fact. Therefore, if the table exists, then there's a table. Who created the table? It's not just that I don't care who created it, it's that I can't see beyond the fact of the table. It's there. That's all that is real. Whether somebody created it or not, that's unreal. That's hocus pocus. Reality is the table. And if you say, but where did this reality come from? In the world of emotion, that question doesn't fit. That's it. That's the extent of the emotion's reality. The extent of the animal soul's reality is the fact of its existence. There is a world, that's for sure. Everything else the animal soul cannot relate to. On the other hand, the godly soul is primarily intelligent, basically intelligent, and therefore it is the exact opposite of the animal soul. For the godly soul, there is God, that's for sure. What about this world? Who needs this world? What is the purpose of the world? These are questions that a godly soul finds meaningful. The first question that the first human being asked was, what is all this for? Not is there a God, but is there a justification for a world? Why should there be a world? Particularly a world with a non-kosher tree in it. So what one soul takes for granted, the animal soul takes existence for granted, the other soul questions. The godly soul takes godliness for granted. To the animal soul, godliness is a question. Someplace in between, we have natural intelligence. Our intelligence is not godly. It doesn't know God as our godly soul does, but neither does it take the world for granted. It's open to suggestion. It can study the world, find out more about it, discover that the world is not necessarily what it appears to be, which is basically what science has been discovering in the past couple of years. The further you look and the closer you get to the essence of physical matter, the less you see and the less there is. And on the other hand, the intelligence can start seeing that which we never see with our physical eye, and that basically the world was created for a purpose. And the purpose is to turn the world upside down, which in the end is really right side up. That which is obvious and appears is visible. We find out, we see it disappear under the microscope, and that which is invisible, because it's abstract, because it's godly, we see it become visible. We see how the world that seems to be so real and so substantial, so solid, really isn't. It's really quite mystical when you look at it under the microscope. And on the other hand, God, who seems to be so elusive and so unknowable, really is knowable. We can understand God, we can apprehend God, we can learn more about God, we know what His purpose is, we know what godliness means, and so on. And so we become closer to the truth, and the truth becomes more real and more tangible. And that is basically getting past the obstruction of the physical condition. And we find this throughout history in very real, sometimes painful ways. There were times when Jews had to go without food. There were times we had to go without water. They didn't know where the water would be coming from in the desert when we left Egypt. They didn't know there would be a stone that would give water. They were tested to see if they would remain loyal to God while believing that there is a threat of going for years without water in a desert. In other words, what is this test? Does water and the need for water rival our attachment to God? Is it as strong? Is it as real? would you give up God in exchange for water? Can you be Jewish without water? Well, over and over again, we've shown that we can be Jewish without water. We've proved that we can be Jewish without food. We can remain Jews without a country, without an army, without a language. What human need, what impulse of an animal soul, what ingredient in human nature have we not already punctured and shot holes through, where it appears as if it's absolutely necessary? We've gone past it. Example of Avraham and Yitzchak. Abraham was tested to see if he would give up his only son. What did that accomplish? What's the point of such a test? What it accomplished was that human nature, which dictates that a father's love for his only son is the greatest love in the world, is the greatest force in the world, Avraham proved that that's wrong. It is not the greatest force in the world. It is subject to a higher authority, subject to a higher purpose. So human nature, human attachments, human wants, human conditions, no matter how intense they seem to be, no matter how real and invincible they seem to be, and seem to say, you cannot do without this, you can't go against this law of nature, we've shown over and over again how it will bow to the godly impulse of a Jew. What happened in the Holocaust? In olden days, when Jews were forced to choose between bowing to the cross or losing their life, in the Inquisition, for example, they refused to bow to the cross. In the Holocaust, that choice was not given. Jews were dying because they were Jews. But they weren't given the option of converting, and that made their death more difficult. The test that the people of the Holocaust went through was much more intense, on a much higher level than the people of the Inquisition. If you have a choice between bowing to an idol or giving up your life, you see clearly in front of you what your options are. And bowing to a cross is so distasteful, so unacceptable, goes so much against the grain of a Jew's heart, that you have no choice but to refuse to bow, whatever the consequences will be. But what happened with the Jews in the Holocaust is that they weren't asked to give up their Yiddishkeit. They were told that even if they were to give it up consciously, even if they were to swear it off, even if they were to pledge allegiance to some other religion, they were going to die because they were Jews. Jews of all sorts of faiths, but Jews nevertheless. And they had to die. So what were the options left to them? Not tangible options, not practical options. What was left was, you're about to die solely because you're a Jew. Now, that can make you resent being Jewish. Because if you weren't Jewish, you wouldn't be dying now. But are you? Are you resenting being Jewish? You're so Jewish, as a matter of fact, that you can't even convert your way out of it. Because even that wouldn't change anything. So you're stuck in it. You must die because you're a Jew. Do you resent being Jewish? There are many writers who describe various aspects of the Holocaust. Some describe how wonderful the Jews were. Some describe how miserable they were. Some say how one person gave up his bread for another, and the other writer tells you about how one person grabbed bread from the other. Some try to make us look good. Some try to make us look bad. But of all the writers that I've read, that I've heard of, no one says that there were Jews in the gas chambers who shouted their resentment against being Jewish. No such record. Which means to say that as far as anyone knows, as far as we can tell, the 6 million Jews who died in the Holocaust did not die resenting their Jewishness. They accepted their Jewishness even though it was the cause of their death. In some cases, they actually gloried in their Jewishness, even though it meant they must die. And for nothing. If human nature was ever transcended, totally, it was in the Holocaust. You can give up food and still be good. You can give up water and still be good. You can give up money and be good. You can give up country and be good. You can give up your only son and be good. But to give up your very nature as a human being, to transcend even that, And that is to be able to transcend the senselessness of it. To say, I am dying for no reason at all, and I don't resent it. It doesn't disturb me. That's transcending not just a particular human need, it's transcending the whole human condition. And that's why after the Holocaust, what more can we prove to God? What other human condition hasn't yet been sanctified, hasn't yet been made transparent, so that it no longer is an interference to God, it no longer rivals God? We've already shown that godliness is stronger than it. No one can ever say, since the time of Avraham, that one's children, or devotion to one's children, will prevent one from serving God. There's no such thing. It's already been shown. Avraham served God beyond his parental instincts. No one can ever say that the need for food or for comfort will keep people from serving God. No such thing. No one can ever say that the need for security or a country or dignity will keep a Jew from serving God. And now, after the Holocaust, no one can say that the human condition will prevent a Jew from serving God. That if you deny a person his very human condition, then he can't go beyond that. There is nothing beyond that, even if God wants him to go beyond it. You can't say that either, because the Jew can. 6 million Jews did. So when we talk about elevating the physical world, it's not as mystical as it sounds. It's quite tangible. What we're saying is that whatever human need we have, and continue to have, we don't dismiss it. We're not ascetic, we're not celibate, we're not against having physical possessions, we're not into being poor. We have these human needs, but they cannot and will not interfere with our Jewishness. They are not an obstacle to God. God can be comfortable in a world where people eat and drink, because the eating and drinking is not going to conflict with Him, will not deny Him. So we will eat and we will drink because God wants us to, and that's fine, and He can be perfectly comfortable here. It used to be that the need for food rivaled God's presence, because God could say fast, and we would say, no, how can I have to eat? But we've shown that we don't have to eat. Jews have gone over and over again for extended periods of time without any food at all, and still refused to bite into a non-kosher sandwich. So food is no longer an obstacle to God. Drink is no longer an obstacle to God. What is? What is it about ourselves? What have we not yet shown to be transparent and flexible and willing to bow to God's will? I don't mean to go into this, but the one thing that has not bowed to God's will is our desire to serve Him. To serve Him. That we refuse to give up. When we get into godliness, we get into serving God, we're willing to give up food, we're willing to give up drink, but we want to do it our way. I want to do it my way. I want to serve God. That's not the issue. But what's standing in the way is, I want to serve Him my way. There are people all over the world, ironically, who are so set in their way of serving God that if God Himself would come and say, serve me some other way, they would refuse. For example, you go to the extreme right, to the zealots. If God Himself would come to them and say, don't hate non-religious Jews, they wouldn't listen. They would think He's making it up. They would say He's just testing us. They wouldn't believe it, because they've got it so set in their minds that this is the way to serve God, that even God Himself could not change their minds. And on the other extreme left, there are those who are so passive, the doves who are so passive, that if God would come and say, stand up and defend yourself in Israel, fight back, they would say, nope, you can't be God. God would never say that. This is the final obstacle. We've given up all of our lower needs for God. Our parents have. History has. In history, Jews have given up everything for God. The one thing we're not willing to give up is our determination to serve God our way. I will serve God the way I want to serve Him, not the way He wants to be served. The way I want to serve Him, that's how He wants to be served, whether He knows it or not. So what does it mean to serve God? To never lose your temper? It depends. If you lose your temper once a year, then to you serving God would mean never losing your temper. If you lose your temper once a day, then serving God can mean losing it only 3 times a week. But for a person who loses his temper every day to say, well, I'm going to start serving God, and from now on, I will never again lose my temper, it's ambitious, but it isn't necessary. It's not how much you accomplish, but the effort you put into the transformation. When a person who has a temper can say no to his temper because that's what God wants, then you've punched a hole in it. Then it is no longer an obstacle to God. It's still a nasty habit, but it can no longer rival your devotion to God, because your temper will bow to God. How do you know that it'll bow? Because once in a while you clamp down and you don't lose your temper, because that's what God wants. So when the behaviorists come along and say that a person with a nasty temper cannot control his anger, God comes along and says, if I ask you to, you will. And we will. You say, but he is of this kind of temperament. This is his nature. It doesn't matter. The temperament will bow if that's what God wants. And what God wants is movement. Movement, change, progress. To be a little better today than you were yesterday. To be a little closer to him today than you were yesterday. A little bit closer tomorrow than you are today. And if you're doing that, then you're doing everything. There's no need to throw doubts into what you're doing and to wonder whether you're doing enough. If today you are more Jewish than you were yesterday, that's what God wants. Under these circumstances, to sit down and to question whether you're doing the right thing would be sabotage. That would be your animal soul saying, well, you're really not sure what God wants, so why make such an effort and wait until you find out for sure? The ultimate truth, in terms of how do I know where my mission lies and what it is that God wants of me, so that I'm not confused by the animal soul. There's a famous story about that. There are 2 people who come into town on a Friday afternoon. A wagon driver makes his living driving the wagon, and the wealthy man who had rented the wagon. So they both come into town just before Shabbos, and they run off to prepare for Shabbos. The wealthy guy goes off to his palace, and the poor man, the wagon driver, finds a room in a hotel, in an inn. On the way to shul, the rich man comes across another wagon that had, in its rush to get home for Shabbos, slipped off the road, and 2 of its wheels are stuck in the mud, and the wagon driver is desperate to get home before the sun sets. So the wealthy man decides that he's going to do a big mitzvah, and he's going to help this guy out of the mud. But he doesn't know about horses, and he doesn't know about wagons, and he doesn't know about mud. He never did this before. But he's willing to try. So he tries, and he gets himself muddy, and he hurts himself, and he gets all bloodied up, and the wagon remains stuck in the mud. In the meantime, the wagon driver, the first wagon driver, gets ready for Shabbos and goes off to shul. They finish davening, and all the poor people in the city, as is the custom, or was the custom in the shtetl, all the poor people of the shtetl lined up, waiting for their hosts to invite them for a Shabbos meal. Well, there was one wealthy man who was usually the host to 4 poor people, never came to shul that night because he was out in the mud trying to get the wagon out. So these 4 people who would have been invited to his home had nowhere to go. So the wagon driver, who is a stranger in town, decides that he's going to invite these 4 poor people up to his room at the inn and share with them the loaf of bread or bagel that he had. So the 5 of them go up to the room and they share this bagel, and of course, in the end, all 5 of them are still hungry, and the wagon is still stuck in the mud. So what happened here was that the wagon driver and the rich man switched mitzvahs. They swapped their mitzvahs. They got confused. The wealthy man, who's supposed to be feeding the poor, is trying to schlep a horse out of the mud. And the wagon driver, who knows how to get wagons out of the mud, is trying to feed the poor. And it's a pity on both of them. That's called blungendikin neshamas. Neshamas that had lost their way and were doing the wrong mitzvahs. But the point of it is that we sometimes need to know where are we supposed to be making our contribution. Because we can, with the most noble intentions, end up doing the wrong thing. And if you're doing the wrong thing, you'll accomplish nothing. So it could be that this guy that was really meant to be studying all day long is very noble. He wants to support his family, and he wants to go to work, but he has two left hands, and he's not going to make any money anyway, so he won't have money in the end, and he won't learn. On the other hand, there are those people that could be accomplishing a lot in the world, but they decide that they want to learn. They like to read, so they're going to stay home. A great scholar is not going to become. A big genius and an authority in Torah he'll never be. So in the meantime, nothing is getting done that he could have accomplished had he been out there in the world working or whatever. So the worker could mistakenly decide that he's going to become a learner, and the learner can mistakenly decide that he's going to give up learning and go out and support his family. Ultimately, for a chassid, the answer is that for this kind of question, for this kind of a decision that the foot soldier has to make, there is a general that helps him make the decision. That's the role of the Tsadik. While we're struggling with our animal souls and with our temptations and our confusions and our hang-ups and so on in the physical world, God created Tzadikim to be there to guide us on our way. They're not busy doing the dirty work, and therefore they can show us where to go and where to apply our efforts. For this we have a Rebbe. A person doesn't undertake a profession and doesn't decide his path in life without asking a Rebbe, is this my thing in life? And very often, the Rebbe's answers are surprising. A guy who thinks that there's no option. He says, look, this is me. I'm the kind that learns. I have to sit in yeshiva and learn. There's no question even. And yet the Rebbe will say, you can't learn. Close the book and go out and work. And on the other hand, there are people who would never have suspected that they were cut out to be learners, and yet the Rebbe will tell them to sit down and apply themselves, and you must learn until you get it through your head. There are those people who want to go to college, but the Rebbe wouldn't hear of it. And then there are those who don't want to go to college. They'd rather sit and learn Tanya or whatever. And the Rebbe says, no, you have to get your degree. You've got to get your PhD. And after that, you've got to do research. So ultimately, the answer is that there is someone who knows. But generally, divine providence leads us to the right place. Generally, if we look at divine providence, how things develop and where we are led and how the demands of the moment set things up for us, it usually is quite clear as to where we're supposed to be making our contribution as a Jew in the world.